Order, order. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this public evidence session of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Select Committee. We are joined this morning by a couple of colleagues from committees outside our own membership. We're joined by the Chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, Tony Atsa, and John Glenn, member of the Treasury Select Committee. This morning we are going to be scrutinising the potential impacts of the proposed changes to agricultural property relief and business property relief on the farming sector as part of our recently launched inquiry into the future of farming. We have two panels of witnesses today, and we shall be pushing hard to get as much information into a relatively short period of time as possible. So, as is always the case, less is more on these occasions. Brevity is appreciated. For my own part, I would simply remind the committee and those observing our proceedings of the declarations previously made to this committee and also those included in my entry in the Register of Members' Financial Interests. Gentlemen, good morning. You'll see we've not incurred too much taxpayers' money in keeping the committee room warm for you this morning rather. But can I ask you, first of all, for the benefit of the meeting and for the official record, to introduce yourselves. Perhaps we'll just start on the left here and work along the panel.
Good morning, I'm David Sturrock. I'm a Senior Research Economist at the Institute for Fiscal Studies.
Good morning, I'm Dr. Arun Advani. I'm an Associate Professor in Economics at the University of Warwick, and I'm Director of the Centre for the Analysis of Taxation.
Jeremy Moody, Secretary and Advisor to the Central Association of Agricultural Valuers, representing, qualifying and briefing some 3,000 of those advising farmers and owners and others across the whole United Kingdom.
Good morning, Stuart Maggs, Head of Private Client Services at HoC Percival LLP. I specialise in estate and succession planning for farmers and other business owners.
Okay, thank you very much. We're very grateful to you for your time in providing written evidence for us as well this morning. David and Arun, if I can maybe just start with you first of all. Looking at the rationale for reforming APR and BPR from an economic and taxation perspective, government has stated that its measures will tackle tax avoidance by the super wealthy. Who are the super wealthy in this context, and how effective do you think they will be in that aim?
Looking at who would be affected by this change in tax, then it is those who would hold some combination of agriculture and business property above a certain amount at death into their estate. I don't have an exact definition of who the super wealthy would be, but we would expect that as a result of these changes, the effective tax rates on some what are, in some sense, relatively largest estates of multiple millions would pay a higher tax rate as a result of this. Mm-hmm. The degree to which that happens depends on how people react, whether or not they take other action, such as making lifetime gifts such that their wealth doesn't fall into their estate. Mm. But I would expect this will have some impact on those with very large estates.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Advani, do you want to?
Yeah, so inheritance tax for most people gives you about £500,000 that's tax-free when you include the two main allowances, and then you pay a 40% rate above that. So you'd expect that as people have more wealth, you'd end up getting towards a 40% rate on average across their estate. If you look at estates that are worth £10 million, the average tax rate that's actually paid on inheritance is about 23%. That varies a lot, though, because there are people at that level who are paying, a quarter of people at that level are paying something like 37%. Another quarter are paying less than 9%. 1 in 6 at that level are paying less than 4%. So there's a huge range among well-off people, among people with high levels of wealth, in the amount of tax they are paying in inheritance tax. So there may be a case for having particular reliefs with stated purposes. I think what's really important for this committee to scrutinise and for other committees to scrutinise is what are exactly the reliefs that are there. Are they serving their purpose at the moment? Because they are creating this huge inequality even among wealthy people in how much tax is being paid. I think that's really the question.
Because it's a fairly well documented route for people wishing to avoid inheritance tax. The purchase of land, not necessarily even for food production purposes. To what extent do you feel that these changes are going to catch these people? Do you think it will discourage them from making these investments in the future? And who else might be caught up in the net?
I think the concern with the way the reform has been done is that it still leaves a 20% effective rate. It's not quite how it works, but roughly a 20% effective rate above the threshold that's been set. Now, one reason for doing that is because there are farmers who you might be concerned about who are earning who have wealth a bit above the current tax-free threshold, who you want to give a lower rate to because of the well-documented concerns about incomes of farmers. But the downside is it still means that if you have, say, £100 million or £1 billion that you want to put into farmland, 20% rate is still much more attractive than other sorts of assets. And so what you will still have in this world is people who want to buy up agricultural land competing with genuine farmers who are trying to expand their farm, who are really actually wanting to work on the land. They're still going to have to compete with much better off people. One other just quick thing to add is that this came in a budget in which there were other reforms, removing some of the relief around pensions and also bringing former non-doms into inheritance tax. And so there are actually more people now who will be looking for ways to reduce their inheritance tax bill, which might, if anything, drive up the amount of demand for agricultural land that's still relatively tax privileged.
So some of the possible implications or consequences of this that we've heard spoken about, such as the lowering of or slowing of land price inflation, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I get the suggestion that you think that's unlikely.
Yeah, the 20% tax rate for agriculture on its own would probably slow it slightly, but not as much as it could do if it had been 40% after some threshold. But other changes made at the same time mean that I think overall the net effect of the budget is probably not going to be that
insignificant. John, yours.
Could I just ask you about business rollover relief? I think there's a wide consensus that people that sell businesses defer capital gains tax by buying large tracts of land. Sort of the people that most people feel should be dealt with. Could it not have been more effective and more targeted to use business rollover relief to actually tackle those people who were getting massive relief from capital gains tax? And wouldn't that have yielded more than actually using this mechanism, which allegedly risks bringing in practicing farmers who will be more troubled by the outcome?
Yeah, so for the benefit of the committee, in case not everyone follows all the tax details, it's the case that if you sell assets that are normally liable to capital gains tax, but you purchase agricultural land, then you can not have to pay the capital gains tax up front. You essentially get a relief while you're buying that. And a fairly standard planning strategy would be to sell those assets, get your large gain, purchase agricultural property, and if you hold that until you die, then you are relieved of inheritance tax, but also relieved then of the capital gains tax because you don't pay capital gains tax on assets you hold till death. So I think something that hasn't seemed to have been looked at this budget, but that certainly should be scrutinised because it causes this exact problem, is the fact that relief for any asset I'm selling, if I'm then using it to buy agricultural land, is a way in which I can avoid the capital gains and currently inheritance tax. And that creates demand for agricultural land from people who have no desire to farm the land but want to buy it because they're getting it from a tax minimisation perspective.
That would be a change that would not have the impact on those who are currently using the land for agricultural purposes.
That reform in itself
wouldn't
affect the people who are currently using the land for agricultural food production.
Why do you think that wouldn't have been looked at? Because it would have clearly have saved the government lots of challenges presentationally.
I can't really speculate on what the government does. Hopefully at Treasury Select you can ask the ministers about that. I have no idea.
Move on to the next lot.
Yeah.
Can I ask about the net effect? And if we look at the OBR in page 70, table 3.8, it says there's a whole list of measures of which is high or very high uncertainty. And obviously we understand that farmers and some of those that advise farmers will be able to put mitigations to some extent, depending on the age, the family structure and so on. What do you think about the high and very high uncertainty that the impartial OBR judges would accrue from these changes?
I agree. I think there is a high uncertainty about how large the behavioural effects will be, because one would expect that, as the sort of conversations have been going for the last month since the budget, there'll be a month and a bit, there's been a lot of conversation about actually what should farmers be doing to plan. Some of the comments by government ministers have been, well, take advice, work out how you can plan. There's fairly standard inheritance tax planning. It's not special for farmers. That is, if you gift assets and gift them more than 7 years before you die, that's tax-free. One of the reasons that farmers won't have been doing that, and owners of agricultural land won't have been doing that, whether they're farming it or not, in recent years, will be that if you hold the asset till you die, the capital gains tax is also wiped out. Whereas now, if you pass it on before that, then the capital gains tax isn't payable immediately, but if the next generation were to sell the asset, capital gains tax would be due on that. And so that isn't a problem for somebody, again, where it's a family farm that's going to be carried for many generations, because there'll be no capital gains tax as long as the asset remains in the family. But it means that liability isn't wiped out. And so I think that that's created some pressure towards people hanging on to the asset until death, because then you're sure that both those things are wiped out. That might be one of the reasons why the current structure of the relief up until this reform hasn't been a great one. I mean, one thing just to add for the committee's benefit, if you weren't aware, in 1988, Nigel Lawson looked at the possibility of moving from a 50% to 100% relief. And he explicitly said he didn't want to do it for three reasons. And he said it would remove the present incentive that was present at the time for passing on control of businesses and farms during lifetime, which he thought was really important as part of making sure that you had that planned continuity rather than just continuity on death. So people would actually think about when they wanted to hand over and make sure the next generation were looking after the assets. It would provide a complete tax shelter, and it would induce extensive and undesirable behavioural change. Those are the three comments he made in his papers. Can
I just sort of probe a little bit more in terms of the sort of net effect? I mean, David, perhaps we'll come to you in a sec, but your boss, Paul Johnson, who I've done media with, is sort of totally relaxed about this change. He sees it as a clear loophole. But one of the things that I think is vexing for the farming industry is the interaction with their operating model. So, I'll have a constituent says their farm's worth 8 million, maximise all the conceivable reliefs, they've got 5 million, creates a 20% of that, $1 million liability, paid over 10 years interest free. But 100,000 a year for 10 years is a lot of money for a farm that's not making very much. Have you done any analysis on the sector itself and the sort of cash flow dynamics of quite low return businesses, and therefore how that nets out in terms of the effect on the public finances?
We've not done any explicit analysis of that ourselves in terms of the dynamics of the sector or what it would mean for the amounts raised by this policy. I would note that in addition to the ability to spread kind of explicitly the tax payments over a 10-year period, then at least going forwards, there's an ability in principle to spread those further by sort of private action saving and perhaps using other products. But I agree with you that the amounts resulting still can be large compared to the incomes for some farms.
If I could just ask my last question, Chair. Could I turn this to Jeremy and Stuart? I mean, obviously, Jeremy, you've got a career of experience in terms of advice and analysis of the rural economy, and surely most savvy farmers can find ways of mitigating the full extent of this. Isn't there a lot of sort of unnecessary concern? How do you sort of reconcile the fact that there's so many mechanisms available with the deferral over 7 years, and after all, farmers use public services. They must recognise that there are challenges. Revenue needs to be raised. Maybe you don't want to address that point, but in terms of the first point, how do you see the sort of options that exist, and are they sufficient?
The problems here then really arise from the low level of the £1 million threshold compared to farming assets. You are looking at the main mitigations, as has been indicated, by gifting. You need to have an adequate, sufficient number of willing, competent, capable, interested members of the family if you're going to try and pursue some of the lines that ministers have taken. And they have to be people who are going to be able to get on with each other. And so some of the strategies that are being outlined are, for many people, simply not realistic, because they don't have more than 1 or 2 children who are involved in the business. It limits their capacity to do this. Other mitigations are possible, but it is the scale of the task. And picking up on the earlier question, I've just been doing some modelling for Northern Irish farms, and the spreading it over 10 years is effectively the equivalent of something like 3/4 of an extra employee on the business. it is a very significant shock on what the business can actually pay out of going earnings, leaving only not much, if anything, left for breakfast or for reinvestment.
Won't the NFU Mutual and others provide financial instruments to many earlier on to make mitigations so they can plan?
That is likely, but that is going to be more available for those people who are younger. That is not a route for the 91-year-old widower.
So the nature of my farming clients certainly is that the natural course of events over the last 30 years has been best advice, has been retain the farm until the day you die, which means that we've got a lot of 70, 80 and even 90-year-olds who are still working farmers, who are still going out on the farm tending to the livestock in the morning.
What's the average age of farmers? It's in the mid-60s?
In the mid-60s, I think, somewhere. But usually the farm, even if you've got the next generation involved, then to bring the average down, the person who owns the farm has naturally been at the elder end of the spectrum. So this change coming in now has really hit home to farmers because they're in a situation where there's nothing that they can do about it. They can't give away and survive 7 years. Even if they could give away, it wouldn't be effective. So there are rules called gifts with reservation, and that means that if you give something away but you still continue to enjoy a benefit from it, i.e. you're one of 3 families living on the same farm, it's paying for mum, who's a widow, it's paying for the parents of the children who are coming up, then all 3 of them together, mum can't give away the farm without being taxed as if she still owned it at the date of her death. So she can't plan, which means this charge is going to be a burden. And with agricultural estates getting a rate of return of about 0.5% to 1%, it simply means this is going to be unaffordable. And so farms are going to have to sell land or sell up. And it's going to happen a lot.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, you want to come in at this stage?
No, I'm all right for this
one. You're okay?
Later.
In which case, we'll move on to Charlie.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for coming in this morning. I'd like to ask a question to each of the panellists, perhaps starting with David and moving along, whether you could each reflect on the Treasury's figures, which say that around 500 estates will be impacted each year. The fact that those figures are contradicted by DEFRA, another government department, and whether you feel that APR has been taken into account the same impact as BPR has in some of these figures. So just some reflections on that.
Yep, happy to start off on this. So I think kind of broadly, I would say that if wanting to know what we think will be happening in terms of estates being affected in the coming years, then the figures to look at are forecasts based on what we've seen from recent estates. So for clarity, that figure that's produced by OBR, HMRC and Treasury for around 500 estates being affected is based on a forecast of how many hold combined agricultural and business assets that would be above a certain threshold. One thing to note, to speak to part of your question, is that there were kind of additional figures released by the Treasury to show the impact of including also business assets held by those who are claiming APR, and that doesn't radically change this picture. So I think that's taken into account by these figures. In terms of how far this number represents estates that will be affected, it's worth noting that this is on a no behavioural change basis. We might expect that of these estates who, if they did nothing, would pay higher tax. Some will change the ownership structure of their farm or make gifts in a way which should mean that number could be lower. Now, of course, there's a lot of uncertainty from that behavioural change, but also the economic factors that drive forecasts like land prices, and so there is uncertainty in both directions on those figures. In terms of how they stand relative to the figures from DEFRA, I would sort of note that there are several reasons why those figures are capturing different things and trying to capture different things, and it's not easy to kind of compare and read across, and I don't think that they're necessarily in contradiction to each other. I think they can well be consistent. There's a lot of different numbers that have been going around, of course. to kind of keep things at a high level, the figures that come from DEFRA are about the value of farm businesses. In order to say something about how many would be potentially taxable, we need to know about their ownership structure. That's something that we don't have data on, together with the value of those farms. And so that's one of the main reasons why they'll kind of be capturing different things. But I think when thinking about estates affected, we want to look at estates data.
Just quickly on that.
Yeah.
One of the challenges, and we've had discussions internally about this, the definition of a farm is something that the government has failed to really produce, and that is something that we're keen to understand, because of course this is based on the fact that the Chancellor told us in the budget speech this was about stopping wealthy people using inheritance tax loopholes, but protecting family farms. Now, it seems to me that's a missing piece of the jigsaw when you come to asking what is a farm.
Yeah, so I think that it's definitely possible, probably, or very, very likely that this change is affecting family farms on kind of any reasonable definition. There's obviously, different ways you could draw that line in terms of excluding some kind of small ownership of agricultural land. There's not any kind of exact definition out there, but depending on where you choose to draw the line, you'll get different potential answers to the question of how many farms are affected.
The issue, this is not putting words in your mouth, but my view would be that there is therefore a concern that a wealthy individual has bought a large house in the country and has 2 fields, is caught in the Treasury figures as being unimpacted, and they're calling them a farm. They're not a farm. They've got some ponies, frankly. Yeah, they're not a working family farm by any real definition, are they? So
there are conditions that you have to meet to qualify for APR, not just kind of owning some land. There's got to be certain activities happening on it, but I agree that there could be some that qualify that we wouldn't, under some reasonable definitions, count as a family farm. Yeah.
So maybe I agree with everything David said, so I'll just maybe make 2 points for interest of time. One is just on that last point of yours. I think completely agree that there are maybe 3 kinds of ownership. There's the own house and a couple of pony paddocks. There's the working family farm, and there's the very caricatured, but a third. There's someone who owns a large amount of agricultural land and lets out to lots of people, and they don't have any interest in farming themselves. They just want to own those assets. And so there's those kind of 3 categories. So I think some of the work that people have been doing recently has been saying, in terms of the percentages of people affected, let's try to exclude some of the other groups. I think come back to the original question of what's the number of affected cases. I think whether you exclude those things doesn't change that sort of 500 a year number. Part of the reason that 500 a year number is obviously much lower than some of the other numbers around is that's a flow measure of the amount per year, and so you want to then aggregate that up over a number of years because there are more years of people who should be worried about being affected. So the other point I would make is, just to make sure it's clear for everyone's understanding, I think there's a distinction between these estates, as David described, and farms. There's also a distinction between farms and farmers. So in terms of the estates that we see who make use of agricultural relief, less than half of estates who are claiming agricultural relief have any income from farming anywhere in the 5 years before death. So about 44% of those claims are from people who you would think of as farmers. They actually had income from farming sometime in the 5 years before they died. The others are from people who owned land that qualifies for the relief, but they don't have any income from farming. And that will be a mix of both that first group of I own a house and some pony paddocks and so on, and that I own a lot of land, I let it out to lots of people, but I'm not involved in farming myself in any way. And so I think it's just worth bearing that in mind.
Mm-hmm. If I might just tidy up some of that last point. To qualify for agricultural property relief, you have to have agricultural land. That's the starting point. And it has to have been used, if it's used by somebody else, for at least 7 years for the purposes of agriculture while you've owned it. So this isn't just the casual ownership of agricultural land. It is that it has been, if you've owned it and farmed it for 2 years yourself, or 7 years somebody else has farmed it, classically as a tenant, then that is required for qualifying. It's not simply there to be bought and be a pony paddock and a short-term exercise. And I think clarifying that will help some of the discussion. I think the other point about APR, picking up on this, APR-only claims, is that there's a slight presumption that farming has to be an owner-occupied model as a form of business, and that will come on to my answering your main question. 100 years ago, 90% of farmland was tenanted. We're now 35% of farmland in England is tenanted, less in other parts of the UK. And to have tenants paying just a going cost for their land, they need to have landlords. And one of the fundamental principles when APR was when working farmer relief was replaced by APR in 1981, was to achieve a neutral tax effect between owned land, owner-occupied land and let land, so management was a business and personal choice, not a tax-driven choice, and that's important. To come back to your... So there's a little bit of sort of pantomime, your word was caricature, there's a bit of pantomime about some of these people who are seen to be buying, because they are actually then making renting opportunities available for people who wouldn't otherwise be able to buy the land. Now, we've looked quite hard at the figures, because I think almost nobody who is closely involved in this feels that the government's figure is remotely representative of what we feel from practice in the field. This has meant doing a lot of work turning over stones that haven't had to be turned over for over a generation. And the most obviously missing part of the government data in this, and assuming that the right questions were asked of the revenue and the revenue gave the right answers to it, and I've no particular reason to doubt that, but we're starting from a very partial picture of what's going on.
Okay.
There are many people who are in farming who are making business property relief only claims. We start with those who are running solely tenanted businesses. We then have the people who are farming because of historic advice or it suits them through the medium of a family farming company. Their shareholdings are BPR assets, just as the tenants' machinery, business, silage and the rest are BPR assets. We then have the people who are partners in farming businesses where land is not a partnership asset. And there will be quite a lot of those, particularly the conventional structure of family farming partnerships. Beyond that, and I referred to turning over stones, one of the things that we've discovered in going through this is the number of people, presumably who don't have a farmhouse for which APR is important, who have simply made their claims under BPR for land, machinery, buildings, livestock and the rest. That might not be the conventional way it's thought about, but it's a legal, proper and effective means of getting straight to relief on market value without all the subjective hoops that you have to do to pass the tests for APR. And there appear to be many more of those about than I would have replied to you 8 weeks ago. It's one of those things that you turn up. The last part then to add, I think, about those numbers is that we have now seen the HMRC guidance on completing inheritance tax returns for business property relief. If you're fully relieved, you put the value in that it is in the balance sheet and the income tax accounts. That is dramatically, in many cases, understating the value of the business property relief assets. For a dairy herd, it could be understated by 70 or more %. And that's a very significant uplift when you think about the value of cattle at 1,800, 2,200 an animal. The last part then to add is that this creates APR claims out of what were previously spouse transfers. If minister's advice is taken, the classic model whereby first spouse dying leaves all goods to the second spouse and benefits then from spouse relief and assets are given on second death, this will at least encourage advised spouses to think about whether they should give, if not $1 million, there are good reasons why they might not want to give the $1 million, to protect the reasons previously given on gifts with reservation benefit and the like, but give some down to the next generation, which would then be an APR, BPR claim that doesn't currently exist. So working through those factors and what we see of the structure of the industry across the UK, we've come to a figure because we don't think a figure in a year is relevant. It's rather saying to the people who die in 2027 that they don't matter. Looking at it over a generation, say 30 years, and you could argue for a longer period, and probably not a shorter period, but to take a conventional 30-year period, that's where we get to our 75,000 farming taxpayers, having worked through the ownership structures of the various businesses that I've just rehearsed.
And the equivalent figure in the Treasury figures would be about 15,000, am I correct
Yes.
in that?
If you multiply that by 30, the Treasury figure by 30,
yeah.
it gets you exactly to that.
I'm going to come to Jenny, then Helena in a second, but Stuart.
Yeah. Very briefly,
Please.
Firstly, can we stop talking about pony paddocks? Pony paddocks don't qualify for agricultural property relief.
Delighted to.
If you put horses on your agricultural property, it stops qualifying for relief, so that's a complete misnomer. You need to have it owned and occupied for the purposes of agriculture for at least 7 years, which means it needs to be farmed properly, husbandry needs to be happening on that land, you need to be growing crops, you can't be running ponies on it, that doesn't qualify. That's the first point. Second point is 500 a year, as you say, 15,000 a generation. The real issue is what does affected mean? What the Treasury have done is they've said, if we picked up this hypothetical set of rules that we've come up with and applied it to 2021, how many people would have paid some tax in those circumstances? That will never happen in the real world. What we ought to be looking at is what Jeremy's done, which is how many people are waking up this morning thinking, am I going to lose my farm if my father dies? And that's much more likely to be about 70, 75,000 people once you run the numbers.
Okay. I also, last week in the debate, sort of mooted the possibility that perhaps those in executory practice were not too rigorous in their assessment of values. Is there any way of ever bottoming that out, or is that
So it's an interesting question. I'm sure that there are some people who are very happy on the basis this is never going to be disposed of. To be fair, there's quite a strong driver, if you're doing your job well, to try and maximise the value of an agricultural estate at the date of death on the basis that it then passes to the next generation with the highest base cost possible for the next generation in case it should be sold. Mm-hmm. And so a well-advised individual will have discussed with the valuer to maximise the value, taking into account everything they can.
And I'm sure that anyone instructing a properly qualified solicitor will be well advised. Jenny.
Sorry, if I might just come in on that, having tested this with members who would be doing the valuations, the impression is that a professional, and talking with Treasury officials about this, a professional valuer will almost always be engaged for any significant agricultural property that is land, buildings and dwellings. It is now, for the reasons of the HMRC advice, it is rare for a professional valuer to be instructed to give a current market value of the business assets, the livestock, the machinery and other goods.
It's lifted from the accounts.
Yes.
Jenny.
Thanks, Chair. I want to go back to land values. I know that we spoke about it at the beginning, but I'm keen to bring in Jeremy's view specifically on this. What's your assessment on what the impact of this policy could have on land values?
It's, with all other things also going on, I think at the moment, once we get past any immediate shock from this, I'm inclined to be with the OBR and most other commentators that it is probably neutral. What it would do over time is tend to disadvantage people who farm as individuals in the marketplace because they face this loss of cash. It leaves those outside buyers who are looking to buy the smaller parcels because it's amenity or something tangible to own or hobby farming or whatever else it is. Those are below the million or still getting the 20% threshold. They're in that market. And those who are farming or holding land through vehicles that don't die, like companies, like charities, institutions, those are still unaffected because it's only individuals who die. And so their liquidity remains in the marketplace. So you probably have a shift, and this is an answer at the UK level. Yeah. I was talking with somebody in Scotland who's farming at one end of a peninsula. His market may be very much a farmer market, and that may have particular effects. But taking the UK market as a whole, there doesn't seem to be a particular reason to suspect that land values move for this at this point.
Okay, understood. Thank you very much. I think at the heart of the debate and the conversation around this is about data and about modelling. And on some side of the arguments, people say it's not going to have a detrimental effect, and on the other side, people say that it does. And I've certainly spoken to a lot of farmers in my own constituency about it. I'd like to bring in David and Arun, particularly on this question. What assessment have you made or done, and what modelling have you carried out that looks at beyond just land values and cost of land, and actually looked at the viability of this? So we know that a 10-year interest-free repayment for a £100,000 tax bill would be £10,000 a year. We also know for £1 million it would be £100,000 a year. We also know that in areas like the east of England, where it's a very dry region, farmers are investing heavily in infrastructure. They're taking out debt, they're taking out loans, they're taking out mortgages, not for the land itself, but to invest. And we've heard from Stuart, and it's well versed, that often profit is 1%, 0.5%. So the viability of the modelling, the viability of the ability for people to pay this, what assessment's been done for that, taking in debt, investment, etc. And as a part two of that, sorry, I know you're about to jump and answer, and as a part two of that, if you've done modelling, if you've done assessments of that, is there a part two to this that looks at what the impact that will be on future investment in farming, in agriculture, and in the investment that the farming communities need as well?
So now that we've seen the reform that's been proposed, we are very interested in exactly this question, because I think it's really important to look at when we set whatever that threshold is going to be, which is currently proposed to £1 million, understanding what those liquidity effects are. When you look at why this relief was introduced, it was introduced explicitly because of the concern about family farms and the liquidity constraints they would face. So we are now at CenTax doing modelling using the secure, completely anonymised HMRC tax data that we've used for other work to look at what the incomes for people who are making these claims are, to look at what the incomes were in the years before death, and as the best you can do to try to approximate what it will be in the future, to understand actually what would they be able to in principle save, what other assets are in the estate as well that might be available, that are non-farm assets that might be liquid, that we use available to pay off part of that
looking
debt.
at that now.
So when will that
be published? When will you be?
Depends on how long the modelling takes and how long it takes. I mean, we have this clearance process that HMRC sets of how
So
it works.
really important.
It'll be in the spring.
Yeah, okay, that's...
And by spring I mean sort of what meteorologically we think was spring rather than government spring.
Yeah,
just to be clear. I'm thinking like March rather than June.
Yeah. And where do you get that data from?
So HMRC makes available for any bona fide researcher a data lab facility in which you can use the secure data, and so we're using that facility.
Okay, brilliant. So you can answer part one of that question, but the part two about what the potential impact it might be in terms of investment in farming, agriculture, etc. You would be able to draw assumptions from it, but we wouldn't. You're saying that from that data you wouldn't be able to.
So that data won't be particularly detailed in terms of us understanding what debt farmers are currently able to take on. I think the key question, and it's actually kind of the core question actually around all of this, is how able are farmers to, and so owners of assets, able to access capital from other sources? Because in a world in which, I don't think this is the world we live in, but in a world in which actually they could freely borrow and it was all very easy and straightforward, then actually some of the concerns also around this might go away, because you would say, we can borrow to be able to pay this off. I think the real concern is that they can't borrow as freely. I think one thing just to add on your point about the fact that farmers will be already taking out debts to be able to invest in infrastructure is that some of that debt will already be reducing some of the asset value within their estate. I think that's one of the reasons the inheritance tax data are the right ones to use for understanding what's the value of the estate as a whole. Because I think it's a mistake sometimes that people take the land value and multiply it by some average thing and don't have information on this kind of debt and other assets.
Yeah, some of that debt would. But
so we would be able to have that.
Yes, but some of it wouldn't, would it?
So the debt
Not
would
all
be,
debt would be...
We would observe the debt in the estate because it would be something that would be taken off. I think what we wouldn't know is about what choices farmers would make in the future in this world, in terms of what investment choices they would make versus when they would decide, actually, I don't necessarily want to do that.
Understood, thank you.
Eleanor.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to bottom out this point that's been touched upon around pony paddocks and whether there's a bit of a myth around that at present. Colleagues have referenced perhaps if somebody had a house and 2 fields and some ponies, they would perhaps currently be on those list of people benefiting from APR. Can the panel, for the benefit of doubt, just clarify whether they are or aren't currently included in APR?
The use that you describe would not qualify for APR unless those horses were sold to the Belgians for food. We are expressly looking at agricultural use. For the purposes of agriculture, it is agricultural land and parcel. That is the bottom of the whole edifice of APR. For 7 years, if it's somebody else, and so no, pony paddocks would not qualify. It's an easy jibe, and it complicates the debate.
Or for 2 years before as well.
2 years if you own, if
you
farm
farm
yourself.
Yes.
And so if you're a hobby farmer as well. So I think the pony paddocks thing is...
those figures are not included in the current assessments that we're looking at. Okay.
Unless you're doing some farming of your own. So if you're doing some hobby farming as part of it, so you can say that I've got some agricultural use, then
2
that's what you
ponies
need to do.
wouldn't. What about 2 dozen rare breed ewes?
That would qualify. So if I can qualify, the bottom end of the APR claim, the under £2 million, is often going to be a combination of people who have come out and bought, for example, some parkland around their house and some sheep are being run on it. That would qualify. It's the person who's bought a field next door that is let to the local farmer, is being used by the local farmer, either because it's being ploughed up or he's running some sheep on it. One day he thinks he might get some development on that because the village boundaries might expand. So he's kept it. It's not now, it's 30, 40 years in the future, but he's kept it. So and the other people who are in there are a lot of small holdings. So the bottom end, sub 2 million-ish, is probably people with very small scale activities with low levels of acreage who are ticking over with probably not doing the agriculture themselves unless it's a small holding, but retaining the land. And then the claim goes in at the date of death, it gets uplifted, and then it passes to the next generation.
There would also be the small areas of land that are used for intensive businesses.
Yes.
So the pigs, the poultry, horticulture, which won't use very much land, but will be piling up value of output on that. And those will be there. And then partly with the way the flow of this goes, but actually as a matter of family history, there will be land owned by other members of the farming family from a past inheritance or something they make available to the farm. And they may have, the aunt may have 50 acres. That would come in on this and simply be then farmed as part of a larger exercise. Just simply by the way, there's been previous devolution of assets.
What I'm hearing from you then is that when various different claims have been bandied around about a percentage that may be affected or not affected by these changes, some have rebutted those figures by saying actually those who aren't impacted are actually those people with pony paddocks or whatever. But actually what I'm hearing from the panel is that those people who are included in those figures are genuinely farming, who are benefited from an APR at present.
They may not be the ones farming it, but the land should be being...
Land is genuinely being farmed. Yeah, okay, that's clear. I also wanted to...
It may just be worth pointing out that all these issues go to the Valuation Office Agency, and the Valuation Office Agency, if it senses a problem, may come out and look, and at this point they are the eyes of the revenue for this purpose and would report back, and they have skilled agricultural valuers in their membership doing this. So that won't be in every case.
In your experience?
Sorry?
Does that happen often in your experience, Jeremy?
Probably not in say half of cases, but it happens where they sense something is to be checked.
Okay. And Jeremy, you also mentioned that the changes we're talking about today have not impacted at all those institutions that don't die. I was quite surprised when speaking to local farmers to learn that a lot of farmland in my constituency in Hastings and Rye is owned by an Oxford college, All Souls College. I understand this is fairly common. A lot of land is owned by the Oxbridge colleges, by the big private schools, by big institutions that don't die. With all of your expertise as a panel in this area of tax, are there any changes you would propose to those institutions that don't die that you feel may contribute to the farming sector in future to raise revenue from those institutions?
Yeah, because the first point, perhaps, is that they are then making land available for tenants to rent. And they are expressly, unlike other sectors, they are doing so with a very long-term horizon, and so capable of offering the longer tenancies that many people say would be desirable for the sector. So this is where there's a risk in caricature in looking at this. I think I'd answer then more generally by saying that I think it would be more consistent with the principles of good taxation to raise tax when money is available to pay it. And that points more to disposal than it does to taxing whenever the Grim Reaper chooses to come, and often perhaps sequentially in a generation. So the ways in which you do that, I think, are open to debate. So I'm not necessarily going down the road that was flagged earlier, but it is better for business planning, it is better for investment, and it is more rational for tax policy to take money when there is money available to pay it, rather than the tax itself driving change.
David, Arun, any reflections on that?
I don't want to add anything on that one. That's not something I've sort of thought
we
about
are
in depth.
coming under some pressure of time. I've got Andrew and Sarah wanting to come in on this, please, very briefly, so we can. There's very important material that we do still need to cover. Andrew.
Yeah, we think we picked up one of my questions, which is fine. But look, one of the great troubles with public discourse on this is that we've got too many different sets of figures that roll against each other. So we're comparing 1 year retrospective with 30 years, I think, in your thing, and we're scrutinising the Treasury assumptions. I think you forgive me, I think me and many colleagues I talk to struggle with a 30-year 70,000, 75,000 by not understanding, not having the level of scrutiny the Treasury figures do. Can you tell us a bit more about it? So you mentioned that within it there were some people who own lands but use it as renting opportunities, so they're not actually farming themselves. Are they included? Let me go through them. Are they included in the 70 figure in it? Do you include, say, farmers that have no children, so yes, they won't be passing it on, so they wouldn't get the inheritance? So they wouldn't have the opportunity to pass those farms on because they have no children.
Unless they had brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces.
Okay, but we don't get the sense of, but that's something the general public in my constituency don't have that opportunity in their own areas, but so it's a special relationship. So when we talk of 30 years and 75,000 figures, that's a really wide canvas for us to understand without understanding assumptions.
Well, firstly, it is on the assumption, implicit assumption in this, and again, all these are rough averages to get to figures, is to take it that farming assets are devolved down a generation, and typically a generation from birth of one generation to the next, call it 30 years. That's a rough figure for this, and would be a conventional figure for this. And then it's the question of what family members that you have, and they needn't necessarily be direct lineal descendants, and sometimes it's grandchildren, and it may be laterally within a family. But this is starting with the point that you have people with, the very starting point was looking at those farms that would look, on the face of it, on average across the UK to have a value of at least £1 million. And then to start looking at the composition of the ownership structure of those. So we have the companies and the company shareholders, we have the solely tenants, and then we start looking at the division. We have DEFRA data for this, and this bit feels right from experience, that 46% of farms, so for England, but read across, and it's probably a higher fraction in Northern Ireland, 46% of farms are solely owned by one person, and 49% are owned in combination by members of a family. So classically, as it were, married couple and one child, married couple and two children, various
And you have
permutations.
data on that?
Yes.
That you can provide to us?
It's all in the papers I've provided to the committee staff.
An actual breakdown that level, so we understand how many actual farms we've
that is in the paper provided to committee staff and circulated widely, and happy to forward that to you if I have an address.
Thank you.
We have your written evidence already. I have it here. CAAV discussion paper. Thank you. Sarah, you wanted to come in very briefly?
Yes, just very briefly, thank you, Chair. I just want to say, obviously this is incredibly complicated. If the government keeps going ahead on this process, they've set this 1 million threshold. What would be a more realistic threshold that would at least try and offset some of this, if they were to be able to move that band at all?
I'm afraid the answer starts with the question, what is the object of the threshold? If the object is a small family farm, and if we take that as a farm that produces a livelihood and will contain significant owned land, then you are looking at having to increase that threshold quite markedly. It will vary between sectors. So again, I'm sorry, I have most recently been looking at Northern Irish figures for a reason to do with yesterday, but you would be looking at an average value of a cereals farm there probably being 6 million, a dairy farm probably 4 for those capable of meeting those tests. And that's including machinery and livestock and so on for the different types of farm. And then it would be a question of working around that as to what I'm referring back because that would be a matter of the policy objective, but it would be that data that would be where you would start if you were trying to be protecting once you've decided what a small family farm is. If you're trying to do that, then that's where you would get to.
So, as a quantitative person, I'd want to look a bit more at the data that we have from HMRC, referring to my earlier answer. I think that the stated objective of this relief is to protect small family farms and stop the breakup of small family farms. That was the reason the relief was introduced. And so I think it's important to understand, actually, again, what are the liquidity constraints that those farms face, and trying to find out where would a threshold be that would be consistent with that. But I think it's really important to start from that and to remember that in the current form, the way the relief has been structured until since 1995, is one in which actually the relief has driven up the cost of land in a way that's actually not effective, not supporting genuine farmers, because it makes that land more expensive for them. So I think that's the reason why a reform is certainly necessary. I think it's just about where you set that threshold. I think it's a really important question. I think we're certainly doing further work. I'm happy to provide that to committee when we've done that.
This is a question of a non-structural relief for an economic or social purpose. Dr. Advani, just before we move on, we've got your written evidence in relation to the interrelation of agricultural relief and business relief, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but is there anything you would want to add to that?
No, I've covered it.
There are subjects in relation to the geographical variations here. You've been exceptionally patient. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Chair. As has been said, I'm the Chair of the Northern Ireland Select Committee. Yesterday I'm a Welsh MP also, so I have an interest in this question. But yesterday we took evidence on this topic because of the impact that this inheritance tax changes are going to have in Northern Ireland. We heard from the UFU, who said that many of the farms are smaller. They're also owned, so there's very few, if any, tenant farmers. And there are higher land prices. We know that farming policy in the UK is devolved. However, this isn't. And I just wanted to know more about the impact and the consideration of these reforms on the devolved countries. But I'm going to start, with Jeremy, because he was unable to join us yesterday due to technical faults in this room. What are the, and I know you've got a report coming out on Northern Ireland, but what are the main things that you need to flag with us?
I think the particular things to pick out, I'll pick out on Northern Ireland and I'll pick out on Scotland at this point. On Northern Ireland, as you say, smaller, very livestock-based units in the main. Some of that, of course, includes intensive pigs and poultry coming through. Higher land values. If you go into Armagh, you could easily be 20,000 an acre, obviously less in the Sperrins, but you're looking at distinctively higher land values than you would have outside some hotspots in Great Britain. A pattern which appears to be more strongly sole ownership rather than between members of the family, and so that concentrates value at that point on these units. Where we're getting to on figures is, again, something of the region of 5,500 to 6,000 taxpayers affected. We're getting then, if I play that through, to something around 200 a year, coming through, which again is 40% of the government's total for the whole UK. This is the difficulty of making with reconciling the figures that we can come to with the presentation. The very distinctive point I'd like to make about Scotland, it's not a purely Scottish point, but I think it's 95% a Scottish point. One of the questions that was opening up in the courts at the time when full relief was introduced, and therefore it stopped the discussion, was the value of an agricultural tenancy that continues after the death of a tenant. Now, most Anglo-Welsh tenancies die with the tenant, but in Scotland they continue and can be bequeathed by the tenant, and there are processes for family members to seek it. At that point, that becomes a valuable asset. The case law has been developing since the late 30s, but was critically developing in the very early 90s. For a lowland Scottish arable farm, we think that you are running into the million threshold on an asset that you cannot liquidate. You cannot get value for it compulsorily if you're the tenant. So this is, if you like, a charge for which there is no resource. We think you get there about 300 acres. And that will apply to possibly joint tenancies in England that continue, or a few fixed-term long FBTs in England and Wales. But the point is very distinctively a Scottish one, and will play through on a sector that is already pretty precarious. And I think that's quite an important thing to understand, that it's taking value when an owner-occupier can sell land. An owner-occupier can pledge land to a bank. A tenant can't. And that I think is something that is worth canvassing.
Has anybody else done any work on the devolved nations?
It's something we're looking at as well, again, in the work we're doing now that we know what the reform that there's been a reform that's been proposed. It's something we're looking at as well. So we'll have something, and I'll submit evidence to the committee, and we can share it with your committee as well.
Thank you.
Henry, you want to come?
Yeah, I just would refer the committee to my declaration of interests. Jeremy, you talked about England and Scotland, Northern Ireland. Is there any way that we could get specific figures in respect of Wales?
It would be nice to try. The difficulty really here is we've got aggregate data that will just about stand the weight of judgment at UK level, and a certain amount of modelling and so on is what I'm relying on in Northern Ireland. I've been asked by Scotland to produce a figure how many might be affected, and I've stressed that there's got to be a very large margin of tolerance in Scotland, partly because of the 10,000 crofters that turn up in many of the statistics, which give it a very particular pattern at that point. So for Wales, again, I would like to try. This is all work that's really been driven by the end of October with a lot else happening. It would be nice to try. I don't have a figure for you at the moment. But you're dealing again with a very strongly livestock-based economy. So some dairy herds that will have get down to Pembroke, some very significant dairy herds with value, as well as the machinery in potatoes and other horticulture. It would obviously be different when you get up into the Cambrian Mountains with lower land values but large numbers of sheep. So there's an extent to which it's making judgments on data that covers such a wide spectrum would be the caution on this. So you have, if we come forward with a figure, it will be caveated in terms like that. I don't have one for you now.
Can I just take a sort of step back for a second and thinking long term over the course of this policy, and we have quite a unique agricultural sector in this country because of the way in which land is owned, and that's different if you looked at Europe or in the US, for instance. And we've talked a lot about organisations that don't die. I'm interested about your view about, in the long term, about the changes to the agricultural sector as a result of the policy.
I think inevitably it weakens productive agriculture. I mean, at the moment, this is an interesting policy for a line that hits the people it's supposed to protect and protects those it's supposed to hit, which is awkward. It tends to lead to fractional ownership of land within a business, which must probably complicate its borrowing capability at that point, and also people unwinding mortgages secured on land that they're then giving in different directions, are complications around that. The need for a business to retain competent management, and that's where I think there are issues about people wanting to be equitable between children who are away and children who are intensely involved in the business, and managing that and wanting to keep the people who are the business in the partnership running the business. And that's where, conceivably, it leads to an increase in the let sector as families ensure that land is let to the business by separate ownerships, so there's a coherence to the business. I think the worry goes back to an earlier question around borrowing capacity out of this, both with the cost of the charge and how this may fracture ownership structures to deal with this when many economic pressures are in exactly the reverse direction.
I'd say the recent...
On ownership structures, it's already not a straightforward a matter to secure charges over agricultural property. It's an involved process. It requires experts who know what they're doing. The more dispersed the ownership of the farm is, the harder that's going to be to do. And so it's just going to make things increasingly difficult for people to secure charges over their property.
I was just going to add that I think one of the things that's been very clear since the budget and the sort of focus on the issues that face farming is that there are lots of pressures on farming. I think the wider question for this committee, as it's sort of engaging with this, is how much the use of inheritance tax relief has ever been the appropriate way to support farmers when they have these constraints. I think direct support that actually supports farmers when they're farming, who are farming, might be something that would be more effective at supporting farmers than something that supports only farmers when they die, or in fact owners of agricultural land when they die, where they may or may not be passing it on to descendants who want to hold on to that farm and actually use it. So currently the relief is something that costs money, some of which is going to people who will pass on the land to somebody who actually doesn't want to farm it and might want to sell it on, and at the same time it's not providing support to that maybe second son in a two-son family who actually isn't going to inherit for the reasons that have just been explained, that you wanted to try and consolidate the ownership, but who actually still wants to stay in farming and is trying to find a different way to get access and actually having to compete with someone wealthy who wants to buy up farmland just for the sake of passing it on. So I think the inheritance tax relief has never really, I think, been the best way to support the farming sector.
And just coming back very briefly on that, this is the issue also, though, of the viability of the tenanted sector. It relies on people wanting to invest in land that they are then willing to let. And without that, you don't have tenants, and that's the much easier way for people to gain access to additional ancillary land or for land when they're starting a business, without having to carry the capital cost of ownership and the returns we've talked about. And I don't want to lose sight of that angle in this, because pursuing too narrow a view prejudices that sector.
You also invite me to spend the next 4 hours explaining to the committee what's involved with crofting tenure. I think we'll pass up on that. A croft, for the voice is an area of ground surrounded by red tape.
Exactly.
Sarah, you have questions on the legal implications.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, well, I think, Stuart, as you were mentioning, I think this is many expected to die in the saddle, so they haven't really been making their plans. But what do you think steps, and I'm not asking for legal advice because I know it's very specific, but what sort of legal steps do you think farmers might now try and take to lessen their inheritance tax burden in the future?
So an awful lot. The first thing people are going to need to do is change their wills. The fact that the proposed £1 million isn't transferable seems peculiar because it just puts an additional burden on people, meaning that they've got to change their wills either to leave something down a generation early or to put some sort of complex trust structure in place to capture that relief in order to achieve the numbers that, to be frank, some ministers have been glibly talking about, the 3 million. That's not achievable without some complex tax planning in place involving changing wills, putting structures in place. People are going to be needing to redraft partnership agreements to bring in next generations. Most farms tend to farm in partnership rather than using companies. So they're going to need to be updated. They often haven't been looked at if they exist in the last 30 years. There are certainly people in Norfolk who have partnerships based on a handshake done in 1950. They are going to be trying to move land between generations. That creates a real problem when it comes to the charges that are already in place. So if you're charged to a bank because you've got some borrowings, which is fairly common, then you can't give that land down to the next generation, even if they're in partnership with you, without getting bank consent. And banks often take that as an opportunity to reset their charges, to recharge all the refinancing and the legal processes involved in all of that as well. You're then going to be looking at prenuptial and postnuptial agreements, depending upon whether the next generation is married. Every farmer I've ever spoken to has a horror story about someone they know who got divorced and lost the farm, and therefore they are rightly paranoid about the risk of that, and therefore making sure that the farm is secure to pass down to their children, who may well have been working on it for the last 30 or 40 years with low pay, because they're expecting to pick this up, and now that they're worried that they won't. So extensive, and this pivots back to what we were talking about earlier about people being affected. I think it's potentially a little disingenuous to say that people are only affected if they end up paying tax. If, in order to avoid paying tax, they've had to accrue thousands, if not tens of thousands of legal fees, financial fees, land agents, accountants and valuers in trying to achieve a new structure that is tolerable to them and their personal circumstances. Even with all that, the people who are going to be really caught by this are those who die early, those who can't plan, those who are unfortunate. And by any measure, that has to be a bad way to draw up a tax. To tax the unfortunate, I don't necessarily think is the right way that the Treasury should be bringing things together. You asked the question earlier about what the threshold should be, and there's some discussion about what that might be. I think a straight threshold is probably the wrong way to do it. If what you want to do is stop people investing in farmland to avoid inheritance tax, then what you'd want instead is some sort of clawback, so that you had a relief that applied on sale and deferred the tax, and if you remained in farming for, say, a decade, that tax bill went down by 10% per annum. The person who's just inherited it because they want money will sell it because they can make a much better rate of return on the stock market. The person who is doing it because they're a farmer and that's all that they know how to live their life, they'll keep it and then they won't be impacted by the tax. That's the sort of law that I was expecting they might try and bring in to attack this sort of tax avoidance strategy. It's not what we've seen.
And then,
gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Oh, sorry, Helena, did you want to?
Thank you, Chair. Just to touch on those points, and Stuart, you mentioned expensive legal advice that people might be taking. I won't ask you what your hourly rate is. We know from the evidence that Arun has submitted that 56% of those qualifying for APR under the current regime had not received any income from farming in the last 5 years. Do you think that reflects very wealthy individuals who are not actually genuinely farming, paying for very expensive legal advice in order to take advantage of a loophole that was intended for people genuinely farming?
So I'm aware that there are buyers who are non-agricultural. I very rarely deal with them personally, but the land agents I speak to are aware that they exist and that they're in the market. Institutional advisors are the key contrapoint to farmers when it comes to acquiring farmland. But as to actually answering your question, I think that there are some who will have taken good quality legal advice. But it's probably let farms instead, because where you're going to see the income coming from people who are claiming APR, where they've got no farming income, it's probably because it's let. And so it's coming through a different route, and it won't show up as farming income, it'll show up as let land.
Wouldn't that, on the previous discussion we had about institutions that don't die holding much of that land?
Well, they're not in the figures
so why
for the
would
Treasury
they be paying APR?
Well, because it's not just institutions that own land to let it, it's individuals as well. So, for example, we act for a number of estates.
Net worth individuals, for example.
Yeah, we act for a number of estates who have tenants in place for 30, 40, in some cases 50 or 60 years, multi-generational tenancies under the old Agricultural Holdings Act, which gives people the security to come into farming and then, with that, the benefit of that long tenancy, to actually learn the trade and farm for many, many, many years.
Just to add to that, if I might, if we are to see the growth that would be probably desirable at this time of change in the tenanted sector, retiring farmers are the most likely source of available land to let, and they would then be moving them into this category. I think one slight caution I had on reading the report is that the HMRC material referred to SIC standard industrial classifications. No self-assessment return, I think, puts those figures on it. So somebody has mediated the data, and it might be worth just trying to understand how effectively that was done, given the many ways people describe what they do as a business.
Just one thing I'd add in terms of this point about the let sector. I think the let sector is a really important sector. The tenant farming sector is something we certainly do want to support. I think the key thing to understand about this is for that 56% of people who own land that they're letting out, it's great that they are. I think we want to support that. In a world in which they pay some inheritance tax, and if they chose to sell off the land to somebody else who would instead own it, that person could instead still let it to the same tenant. So I think it doesn't remove necessarily that land from the let sector and have people farming it. It just means that those who are owning it but not actually involved in the farming themselves, it's an asset that passes to somebody else to continue to use it. And so the land obviously doesn't disappear in a world in which inheritance tax is paid.
Thank you.
Right, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Looking at where our next panel are currently seated, I'm going to suspend proceedings for a couple of minutes, a very brief period, to ensure a dignified transfer. So, order. Order, the sitting is resumed. Good morning. You've been with us already for the evidence session this morning. Can I invite the members of the panel to introduce themselves for the benefit of our audience and the official record? Mr. Bradshaw first.
Tom Bradshaw, NFU President, representing 44,000 members across England and Wales. Victoria Vyvyan, President of the Countryland and Business Association, and a farmer and landowner from Cornwall.
Robert Martin, National Chair of the Tenant Farm Association for England and Wales.
Thank you very much for your attendance. Some of you have also submitted written evidence for which we are very grateful. Jenny, can I invite you to start the questioning, please?
Thank you, Chair. This is a question to all of you, but Tom, I might start with yourself and work my way down, if that's okay. What discussions did you have with the Treasury and with government ahead of this announcement on the 30th of October?
The only official discussions were the comments that had been made by the Secretary of State some 11 months ahead of it, that there wouldn't be any changes to agricultural property relief, which were public statements which were then reaffirmed a couple of weeks later. We did get wind that something was being discussed the Wednesday before the budget, and at that point we went public with our campaign to write to MPs, and we had over 3,500 members wrote to MPs ahead of the budget. But there was no formal consultation at all.
Thank you.
I agree with everything that Tom has just said. I think the nature of agricultural property relief has been in the air for a long time, and because we're very much aware of that, we had made representations, detailed representations, to the Treasury about the effect we thought that unconsulted changes to APR might have. So we were never, our views weren't sought, but we did make representations.
Ahead of the 30th?
Yes.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Yes, we also made representation to ministers as also to the Treasury officials. We weren't able to get in to see Rachel Reeves, which would have been a huge help to us, and they took many notes, and that's where we're up to.
Okay, great, thank you. So that was obviously before the 30th, and what communications have you had since the 30th? How receptive has that been? And may I ask what specific recommendations you have made?
So there's been multiple conversations, and I don't think it would be good use of time to go through all of them. But the first meeting on the Monday after the budget that I had with the Secretary of State, Steve Reed, James Murray, the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury, had asked to be present at that meeting on the Monday morning. At that moment, I asked James what the question was that the Treasury had asked themselves. I said, if we understand the question, we can help you find a solution. But until we know the question, it's impossible for us to help you. And it appeared at that point there is no question. And so then it's been incredibly difficult to actually find and recommend a resolution, because if it is a tax loophole, if that is the priority, is to try and close the perceived tax loophole for those who've made wealth outside of agriculture, to invest in agricultural land, to pass it down, then we will all work together to close the loophole. But until we actually know what the exam question is, it is very difficult. So we've had multiple meetings since then, and you know, up to the Prime Minister. The Chancellor so far has refused to engage.
Can I be explicitly clear that in you saying that you're saying that if the government says there's no U-turn, that you haven't come forward with a solution to make this a better policy? Is that what you're saying?
We have all written, all of the organisations represented today have written to the Prime Minister asking for a pause and a consultation. I think this is such a complicated area. There are many ways of making the policy less bad, but a full consultation will hopefully arrive at the right solution rather than a less bad solution.
Understood. Thank you. Victoria?
I think we've probably had all the meetings that are on the list of people you ought to meet immediately of having given them bad news. What I feel the problem has been is that we've had long meetings and no sense whatsoever that any listening is happening. You know, we are talking about the outcomes, we're talking about the long-term effects on the industry, we're talking about the effects on individuals, and everybody nods and smiles and no sense of any listening. And that's why this is such a really helpful inquiry to sit in on, actually. We can argue till the cows come home about the 500 and the 70,000, but if there's no acceptance of the assumption that we're muddling up business assets with personal wealth in this move, and therefore you are going to end up attacking an industry and people's businesses, and that's completely unnecessary.
Understood. And have you had the same question that I asked Tom, if are your recommendations based on trying to improve the policy that's been put forward rather than advocating for a U-turn? And if it is the former, what recommendations have you put forward that you felt need to be heard?
Well, the first thing is the pause. Let's stop and think. Let's not just crash forwards, hoping against hope that this will turn out to be, it'll turn out all right or it'll turn out differently. We agree with the two other associations represented here. A pause to really consider whether there should be a full U-turn and a different approach to agricultural property relief and business property relief. If it's a loophole, HMRC has everything it has in its power to change or close that loophole. And between us, we could find a great many ways of doing that. But this is not the answer to that question. So, in a way, what you're asking is, you've got two questions there. Should we stop? Yes. Should we have a consultation? Yes. But one of those questions, the important questions, is, was this the right thing to do in the first place? Could we actually all be a bit cleverer about this?
Thank you. Robert?
It's the unintended consequences of the tenant sector that's my concern. The evening of the budget, we met with Daniel Zeigner, and we explained to him in words of one syllable the effect that is going to happen. We're going to see shorter-term tenancies, risk-averse landlords, and we're going to see notices to quit, to free land, to sell, to pay tax. You've already heard from one of your other evidence providers today about the fact that they see in the tenant sector, and there is a huge concern with me. You've also heard today regarding the estates that are not affected, the church, the Crown, the Duchy, the Trust, being charitable statuses, the colleges. So we have the private landlords who have been long-term letters of land for hundreds of years. They still want to let land, but if they're going to be affected by the tax implication, then they will have to make the land vacant possession, and tenants will lose their livelihoods.
Yeah, understood. Thank you.
Tonya.
Thank you, Chair. One of the things that's been very clear, especially when we took evidence from with the Northern Ireland Select Committee yesterday, that this is having a huge impact on the well-being of our agricultural communities. I was just wondering what measures you have noticed. What have you noticed about the concerns of farmers and the increase in the concerns? Is it impacting on their mental health? Tom?
I mean, it's very clear. The examples that I'm being sent through are often from what I would say middle-aged farmers concerned about their parents or parent that doesn't believe they have 7 years able to plan, and the awful, unacceptable position that those individuals have been put in. Because somebody said earlier on they haven't taken advice. That's completely wrong. A lot of these people have spent the very best money on tax planning advice, and until the Chancellor sat down, the correct advice was to keep the farm until death. Now they don't have any way to plan through that, and yet they've given everything to producing the food for this country in that period post-Second World War. They really deserve a lot more respect than they have been given by the changes that are proposed. And I am going to talk about the most severe human impacts, which we believe could end up being triggered by this, which is that those people who genuinely are either in ill health or don't believe that they are going to be able to live for 7 years may well decide that they shouldn't be here on April 26. Now, no policy should ever be published that has that unintended side effect. Now, what I'm being told by some people is, well, money doesn't trigger this. And I may agree with them that money doesn't trigger it, but it's not money. This is a lifetime of work. It's the heritage. And the custodianship of that farm.
Anybody else come in at this point? Perhaps.
I think we have very good support in some ways, which is why we know about this. It's not just personal anecdotes. The auction marts run a very, very supportive system of making sure that people who are not just concerned about themselves can report in. So, you can pick up leaflets, you know who to call. We've got a system in Cornwall which, in fact, was first picked up by the health inspectors, because the first thing they know is when somebody phones in because there are dead sheep lying in the fields. That's when they know there's a problem. And they go in and they go to visit and they discover, yes, there's terrible potential for suicide, but also that is on top of a pile of other human pain. Abuse in the family, children not going to school. This is a big problem which finally manifests itself sometimes in that last push. For the next generation issues, we just are saying to everybody to say to your oldies, you've been our tall trees, now we're going to be yours. And that's the best you can do. But, you've had it in your discussions in the House recently about end of life. And the fact of the matter is the nicest, most forbearing, most family-conscious people will go, oh, you could do without me. Whereas the real brutes never think that. So I think it will be those severe cases, but it'll be I think now all I'm going to add is that this is a pebble in a pool to businesses that come out from that business at the centre. We are all employing other people who are all employing people. So it's not just that one thing. Thank you.
Andrew, you wanted to come in at this point?
Yeah, just come in on a couple of questions. Firstly, Tom, I hope you hear from us as a committee the respect we have for yourself and farmers, which is why we're holding this inquiry and want to be able to look at it and shine a light on it from different angles, because that's all of us, I think, on the committee commitment to do that and to do that to the best of our ability. Can I just tease out a couple of questions just to see if you understand the panel, some of the motivation where government's at, and that might allow us to reflect on where the journey is they're trying to get to. So firstly, I think I've heard, I just want to confirm, do you all recognise the government's view there is a loophole, or that something, you recognise you're not against any change, you're not happy with this change?
I'd start by saying this is an unmeasured effect. I like to know data, and I'll always go back and say, find me the number. Is this a perceived problem? Because actually, I'd quite like to buy that land, and somebody else has come in and paved over the odds for it, and that's only happened once in 20 miles around me. Or is this a persistent problem? My grandfather bought a farm. He's a perfectly legitimate farmer. So somebody has to be buying into this system, and they're going to need assets to do that. So I think it's a simplification. However, if there is a loophole, I have every confidence in the advice of this committee and the advice of the Treasury being able to close that loophole, as far as it's necessary, for everybody to have a clear conscience about it. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't be buying farms.
Absolutely. Look, and I say that particularly because when the CLA came to see me before the budget and this was on the table, the CLA position given to me was that no change whatsoever was necessary. So now we seem to be discussing different where change could be necessary.
Well,
is it the CLA position?
I'm trying to bend to your position, actually. This is me being forbearing, but also our position has always been, if you think there's a problem with APR, let's talk about the problem. Let's not just go swinging in there, getting rid of it. And I think it's a mistake in farming to talk about APR without talking about BPR, as the last group was saying, because a lot of the assets, will come under BPR, the stock, for example, in a dairy, and the machinery and so on. So nothing is perfect. Everything can do with being improved, We are none of us perfect. So... and I just want to reiterate Tom's really good point at the beginning. It grates a bit with all of us to be told that we haven't done any tax planning. We did our tax planning. It was called agricultural property relief and business property relief, and we've structured businesses around those reliefs to make them multi-generational businesses. So it feels a little bit condescending when they say, poor souls, they didn't do any planning.
My question was, you accept some change could happen, but not the
usefully,
change.
Yes.
Okay.
Could I just draw our attention, please, Andrew, to a comment that was made in by the Office of Tax Simplification report in 2019. It is generally understood that the main policy rationale for BPR and APR is to prevent the sale or breakup of businesses or farms to finance inheritance tax payments following the death of the owner. Mm-hmm. I still think that statement is absolutely true. And any change to APR or BPR should be on personal wealth and should be affordable rather than being on business wealth. So that is where the suggestions in the earlier panel around making sure that there is available assets to pay the tax probably lead you to a very different proposal to the one that's on the table. And so I think, again, this is where consultation would really help with the experts, because I think it is perfectly possible that out of a grown-up consultation, government may be very surprised at the solutions that can be come up with. But I think what's clear today with the proposal that's been made in the budget is that there is a desire from this government to change where we are today. Mm-hmm. So our position is, let's work with you to get to an outcome that works for all, rather than the blunt instrument we have today.
To add on that, really, if the loophole supposedly was to stop money coming in from outside of agriculture and buying land up, they still have left rollover relief in place. So they really haven't stopped that at all. Mm-hmm. And that's my concern about that one.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you. And the government said, if the government was here, they would be saying this is about all sectors need to contribute, and they've tried to do it fairly. They would say all sectors need to contribute because they're trying to repair public services. Have you done any modelling? Have you got any data you could share for us about what's the impact of what changes need to happen in those public services in rural areas, and any alternative funding you'd have to put into those?
Oh, that's a big question. Fortunately, we have produced a paper with the all-party parliamentary group a couple of years about the rural economy and about how to reinforce and grow the rural economy. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of weaknesses in the public services. It's not, unfortunately, just down to buses. So I take it a little bit amiss. We do pay our taxes. We are talking about capital taxes here, not the fact that we're paying our income tax, we're paying our VAT, we're paying our staff, we're paying their national insurance contributions. We are contributing. Mm-hmm. This is not a sector that is not, and by the way, trundling out a whole fat load of food at the same time, which we are forced to sell at less than market price. So, it's not like we're not contributing. I think that's crept into the dialogue, which I sometimes feel it shouldn't have. Whether or not what we could contribute, which is not very much money, I think it's been associated as a day and a quarter of the NHS is the annual takeout from this particular tax. Is the candle worth the flame? Is it worth ruining an entire industry for 1.25 days of the NHS? I think Mr. Streeting might suggest that he'd like some more help with changing the NHS.
My question was, I was more interested in, have you identified other routes that would raise money to put into public services in rural areas if it wasn't this?
Yes. And it's a long document, and I'd be more than happy to send it to you. But the best way to improve this sector is to grow. Mm-hmm. Help us to invest, help us to grow our businesses. And we have the capacity, because we lag behind the urban areas in terms of productivity, we have the capacity to add 40 billion to the GVA of this country. And funnily enough, that was the sum she was looking for. Mm-hmm. So don't kill us, let us fight our way out of this corner.
I think the other really important thing is that ever since the Second World War, there's been a covenant between farming and government, that farming gets on and does its job of producing food. And it's never really been about the returns. It's been about that way of life, that heritage, that custodianship. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, with other changes in the budget, along with this one, it feels like that covenant has been broken. And we are, with the food we're producing, at very, very low returns, supporting the whole of society. Mm-hmm. And how much more do we need to support society? And let's get to a point where we're paying those taxes through the food we're producing, through getting fair market returns. And there were some interesting elements in the manifesto which could have answered some of those challenges around standards of imports and fairness in the supply chain and public procurement. And let's get them in place so that we are a profitable sector which is driving reinvestment and really delivering for food security, rather than looking at how we generate a little bit more tax income to rebuild our rural services.
Right. I'm keen that we move on at this stage, but John, you've got a very quick intervention.
Just very quickly on process, pre-budgets, you wouldn't normally expect to speak to Treasury ministers, would you? I mean, was it unusual the way that the run-up to the budget was conducted, do you think?
I mean, we will always write to the Chancellor pre-budget and ask for a meeting, and it's down to the Chancellor as to whether she would like to. Or in this case,
I'm trying to be fair to this government in that on fiscal measures, you wouldn't expect to have a dialogue before a budget, would you?
I don't think I was critical. I just said that we hadn't met. No, there was an offer to meet from us, and the Chancellor decided not to take that. Now, if there was going to be a big change that was going to impact our sector, maybe somebody from Treasury would have had a call or a meeting.
Tom, you were reported to have met with the Prime Minister, and it was reported that he had indicated there would be a softening in the approach. Do you have any observations about that report?
What was reported, I don't think it was that there was necessarily, but it was that he was very much listening. And it is a private meeting, and I'm not going to break the trust of that meeting. But what I would say is I felt that the Prime Minister had a far better understanding of the unintended consequences by the end of the meeting than he did at the start of the meeting. But I'm very surprised that as yet we haven't had any firm action on the back of the meeting.
Okay, right. I am going to move on, but you touched there, Tom, on an area where I think it's appropriate. We should remember that actually our proceedings are seen well beyond the confines of Westminster. We're being broadcast, and that much of what we are talking about will have a very direct and human impact on those who are watching our proceedings today. The clerks will arrange for links to relevant support for anybody who feels affected by the evidence they've heard today on our committee social media channels, should anybody require to avail themselves of that. Josh.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to start by echoing Andrew's thanks for coming and being really frank with us. A number of us are on the NFU's parliamentary scheme, and I think we're really looking forward to exploring all these issues around the future of farming outside of London. So, yeah, very much looking forward to that. But just for the benefit of our inquiry, could I ask both you, Tom and Victoria, just to put on record the assessment you've made of the number of farms that might be affected by this and how you arrived at those figures?
We haven't actually published a number of farm businesses. When we have looked at the Treasury data, we've used OBR or previous OBR experts to model this with us. When we take off the long tail, which was being talked about earlier on, we get to 75% of commercial farms that are caught in the eye of this storm. And when I go back to that definition earlier on that I read out from the Office for Tax Simplification, it doesn't talk anywhere there about protecting small businesses. And I think that somehow we have ended up in a place where we think that small businesses should be protected, or this is a government policy, rather than looking at the wider impact of not protecting the wider group of businesses. So we believe 75% of commercial farms that are producing this country's food will be impacted with, or will be within the scope of the change. Now, unfortunately with this, it's a bit of a game of roulette that you never know when your time is coming and whether you are one of the 500 or not. But everyone has to prepare not to be in that number. And that means life insurance, it means pension contributions, and it means extremely expensive professional fees from lawyers. But that cash does not exist within the business. And any cash that was there previously was being reinvested in food production for the future. Instead, now it's going to have to be taken out of the business on those life products and that advice. And it just doesn't seem like that is how we deliver food security and productivity gains for the future.
Well, I'm going to what he said, and also the figures that we worked through are in the region of 70,000 holdings affected. That's because we're taking the same generational view. We don't know when we're going to go, but also, just as an aside to that, which was covered this morning, is we don't know the order in which we're going to die. You know, it's just not given to us to understand that particular part of the plan, and therefore we could take a lot of very expensive advice. In fact, I am going to see my lawyer this afternoon to take said expensive advice and for it to be completely thrown out. So there's no guarantee that the expensive advice you take is going to work. The life insurance, I did think that at his end of life, from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, life insurance probably seemed quite cheap. But from my end of life, life insurance is no longer a cheap option. It would be an expensive option. And as we've said, you know, that would probably have stopped us, you know, DJ Bray are just installing heating in our event space as we speak. That would be instead of. At every point, this will be instead of. The professional advice keeps being covered. But also, I think one of the mistakes that I would like to correct from this morning was that the bank would be happy to lend us money to pay tax. Banks don't lend money to pay tax. It's written quite clearly on all their loan stuff. That's not what they do, because there's a big chance that they're not going to get it back. So over the period, you know, we reckoned in the old sense of calculated at 70,000. The NFU and the CAAV have reckoned it slightly higher than that. A margin of error still leaves a huge number.
And just in terms of, you mentioned holdings, right? So is that based on holding numbers? Because we know that often one farm can have a number of holding numbers. So what I think
I meant it in the terms of business.
Right, okay.
From business.
Okay, thank you for that. Because I think obviously there's this big public debate around the figures, and what we're, I think, as a committee trying to drill down into is how many farms are going to be affected rather than estates. So why do you think there is that disagreement on the figures? And, you know, how can you help us, I suppose, get to that point where we're really talking about businesses being affected as opposed to just, the number of estates for sort of tax purposes?
We can't argue the historic Treasury figures. They are an accurate snapshot of what happened in 2021-22. And I think there has been probably language that even I may have used at times, which has suggested those figures are inaccurate. I think they do misrepresent, but they're not inaccurate. So I think that is something that we should be conscious of. But when the figure came out, 73% of the states won't be affected. That is, when we look at our members' businesses, that is where we have the biggest disagreement, because we believe that 75% of commercial farm businesses will be affected. Now, you don't know if you're impacted, as I've already said, until you know when the time comes that you would be in the eye of this. So I think that probably the other thing is, obviously, with land price inflation, there is that's in double-digit inflation over the past few years, so that means that the number of estates coming into this will be bigger. But also, if you look at when the 100% relief came in 1992, a lot of estates over the decade post-1992 will have, they may have already been tax planning in place pre-92. Post-92, the advice will have been keep the farm asset until death. Now, many of those estates will be getting to a point now, 30 years later, where they are now moving into that period where the owners of those estates could well be in that age, sort of in the twilight of their careers. And that is the area now where I think it's very difficult to ascertain what that profile looks like. But there will be a significant number in there whose planning now was to keep the asset until death, and that would have been from 30 years ago.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Victoria or Robert, before I move on?
Yeah. Whereas the landowners are trying to plan to sort it through, I already have estates in my area who have an inherent tax liability, and they've already given notice to quit to the tenants. And some of those people have no idea whether they'll have a roof over their head next week, next year, wherever it's going to be. So the impact is now. And you mentioned before, how do you meet the Treasury? We meet the Treasury 3 or 4 times a year, because part of what we've said as an organisation is we need to see a slight change in the tax rules. So if you have exemption on inheritance tax for 10 years, but you're prepared to let the land for 10 years and you get the exemption on the tax, that will help to secure the land for the generation within the tenant sector.
Is that Treasury ministers or officials that you're meeting there?
Both. We were in Downing Street, George Dunn and myself, before the budget and also after the budget, before to say we see what would happen if you do this, and then we told them what was going to happen by the changes they had made.
Okay.
Just one follow-up question on that. One of the things that's been talked about a lot is that the biggest sort of financial liability for this would fall on the largest estates, and that's been cited as a reason why it's kind of fair in that sense. But do you have a sense of how many of those large estates are actually made up of many smaller tenanted farms? Because I think that's one of the sort of arguments, particularly you're making, Robert, isn't it? That these large estates actually are made up of a lot of smaller
it is. In the turn of the year, when the notices were put into these tenants, we held a meeting and we had 60 tenants in the room who were going to be affected by this. And at that point, the estate was talking about a Balfour partnership, and that was working really well until the budget, and Balfour doesn't work now. Mm-hmm. So we said to them, would you support us to try to go back to Treasury to get the exemption for the 10 years plus? It was 8 years in ROC, the review, of course. And they said, well, if you can get us this exemption, they said, well, we'll let for 20 years. Mm-hmm. These people have let land for hundreds of years, for long term, 3 or 4 generations of the same family on the same estate. I was the 3rd generation on my estate, but my landlord was a charity, so they're not affected by this. But we have large landowners who have left for years and held historic land masses, and all they want to do is let the land.
I think, could I just add to that, as a large number of our members who are letting land are not letting 40 tenancies. They're letting 2 or 3. That's the majority of them will have 2 or 3 or 4 tenants, and it'll be a mixture of Agricultural Holdings Act tenancies and new FBTs and so on. One thing that hasn't come up is that in these new circumstances, they are going to be liable for their business property relief, and they don't have an asset that they can easily sell to fulfil that obligation. It's certainly true that if there's the first payment is due within 6 months of death, so you can't wait until somebody dies and then start faffing around trying to free up land to sell so that you can pay that first charge. And if you miss that first charge, you pay 9% interest on it, and then that clock really starts to tick. People start to panic. They start to panic about missing the next one. We both sit on the Farm Tenancy Forum, which was established a year ago as a result of the ROC review, and it's been a really great force for collaboration and good between the landlord and tenant sector. I cannot recommend it enough, and I don't think we all went into it thinking that, actually. Yeah, but so I want to support all that Robert says, really, in terms of probably one of the biggest unforeseen consequences of this will be in the tenanted sector.
Yeah. Right, which leads us quite nicely on, Eleanor, to your questions.
Yeah, thank you, and I'm going to, given the discussion so far and conscious of time, I'm going to combine the sections, Chair. Yeah. So can I just begin by echoing my colleagues' comments to place on record our thanks to the farming community, the hard work that everybody in the rural community does day in, day out to put food on our table, and we really appreciate that. And I think as a committee we are very much agreed that, as well as looking at this issue in hand today, as a committee we are determined to look at the wider profitability of the farming sector and the issues that there have been for many years, and if not decades, building up, affecting farmers and the wider community. We've touched briefly on tenant farmers. Robert, I just wanted to ask you about the impact of some of these changes on tenant farmers, and specifically the link with, we talked in the previous evidence session about the fact that over half of those who qualify for APR under the current Treasury figures, which I think nobody's disputing, have not received any income from farming in the last 5 years. So what would be your assessment of those 56% who have qualified for APR but not received any income from farming? What proportion are currently renting out their land to tenant farmers?
I would have thought the vast majority will be, because they won't be just having land sitting doing nothing, because there are schemes available via the government for whether you have a tenant on or whether you are planting trees, whether you've got fallow, whether you've got legume layers. You're not going to just have it sitting dormant, because land goes backward very, very quickly unless it's invested in.
And so I think you've expressed some concerns that with these changes, there might be a smaller pool of land available for tenant farmers.
Yes.
Who do you see buying up that land instead? Would it be other landlords that would then lease the land? Or?
I'm sure if people have got the rollover relief available to them, we've also got, in my area, we've quite a lot of building going on, so people selling land for development and then reinvesting back into that land again. And there was talk, well, if the land comes back in value, well, the tenants can buy it. Well, it's just not going to happen. It's really not going to happen, because there is more of a return for the tenant on his investment than there is for the owner-occupier on their investment. Thomas said people do it for the generation. I have a rent to pay, so I have to do for the profit. And that's because if I don't pay the rent, I'm out.
And there's been some reference to the ROC review into the tenant farming sector, and I know that obviously the government is committed to implementing those recommendations. Have you seen any progress since that review in your sector in terms of those being moved forward under the previous government? And what would be your top recommendations to progress with speed from that review affecting tenant farmers?
Well, Victoria's also already mentioned about the Tenant Farm Forum, which is working really well. We now have the Code of Conduct in place, but why you'd have to have a Code of Conduct to tell people how to behave, I do not know. We have a Tenant Farm Commissioner where the will hopefully be in place by the spring of next year. And I've already reiterated this about the fact of the fourth part was to get exemption from inheritance tax if the landlord lets for 10 years plus. Well, it was 8 years in Rock, but the Tenant Farmers Association have been asking for about 10 to 15 years for 10 years, because if I've got long-term tenure, then I'm prepared to invest. And if you have a well-invested holding for the tenant, it's also a well-invested holding for the landlord as well. Because I am a custodian, as Tom has already said. And if I don't look after the land won't look after me, and I won't be able to generate a profit. And profit may be a very dirty word, but the profit allows me to spend 80% of my income within 30 miles of my business. So I'm supporting the local community. The people that work for me, their children go to the local school, the local village hall, and the whole community that is based around the rural community. Because if I look at what my landlord did back in the day, back in the 1800s, they built a village hall, they built a church, and they were the glue that held the community together.
Thank you. You referenced about profit. I don't think anyone on this committee would think profit was a dirty word, but we are very aware of how the farming sector has become less profitable in recent years. I know we've seen 12,000 farms close in the last decade. I just wondered if the panellists could comment on what they see as the main drivers of that in the last decade. What has been the biggest problems for farmers?
I'll leave Tom very much to talk about profitability. I'm just going to talk a bit about why land holdings are growing. I think we have to be very careful not to look at that and see that that's a bad thing always. For example, one of our members brought together 3 hill farms to make one farm that was a really viable farm for new entrants to come into and equip that farm. There's a big difference between equipped farms and what is referred to as bare land. So I think the tide of history is also running through this. I think we're getting larger holdings developing because people need to make a living. So I think we need to put that background behind it. for tenants, it might seem ultimately that there are fewer tenancies, but that might be because those tenancies can now really make a living. And I think I think we need to be really careful at thinking that necessarily fewer farms means a lot of other people have brought in. There might be all kinds of reasons. The question about who's going to buy the land, the first person who's going to want to buy the land is the person who lives next door, because everybody says you only get one chance to buy the fields on the edge of your farm. Mm-hmm. And that inflates prices, because you will pay almost anything to make sure that you get hold of that land. And we haven't really stuck enough on the new landowners. The new landowners might well be, people say corporates, but that might be a family farm that's been told to incorporate. You know, it's a bit of a broad term. Also, the charities are much, much bigger in this sector, the wildlife trusts. The wildlife trusts are being funded as a charitable sector, but also sometimes funded, by the Environment Agency, for example, to buy land. So it's a much, much more complicated picture, and that's why it's great that you have the time to listen to that.
Just before I bring in Tom on the wider sector issues, you touched on that issue around who is owning the land. If you look at the top 10 recipients of subsidies from DEFRA in recent years, many of the people on that list often are a surprise. Colleges, for example, Oxbridge colleges, or huge multinationals. Do you think that's right? And do you think that the way subsidies have been given out in recent years has incentivised the right kind of actors in the farming industry?
We have very much supported the movement into environmental land management, because after leaving the European Union, the CLA felt very strongly that it would be almost impossible to sit next to somebody on that old Clapham omnibus and explain that you were being paid by the acre, because it would seem necessarily to favour people with more acres. And so the word subsidy to all of us is an old-fashioned word. We don't get subsidised. We get paid by contract to deliver public goods for the government and therefore for the people of the United Kingdom. And that's been a really healthy change. So, yes, and also big isn't necessarily bad. You know, in terms of feeding 65 million people, you need scale. You don't get 180-acre sugar beet farms. It just doesn't happen. The economics don't work out like that. So big isn't always bad. And I think the more commitment that we see from government about pushing forward environmental land management at speed is going to be vital for the success of the sector. But on profitability, Tom is the expert.
Well, Victoria, you've led into that beautifully, because I even have severe questions about the profitability of the environmental land management scheme, if I'm honest with you. And I think that is something that probably deserves an inquiry in itself, but that's not for me to decide. But I mean, the public money for public goods is now a simple contract between farming and government to deliver those services that the public require, and it's not a support payment, and people will do it if they think they can generate profit out of it. Look, there are so many challenges around profit. I think don't underestimate. When I was in the US back in September, and over there they said you've got the most competitive retail sector in the world. And that is the crux of this issue, is that food inflation hasn't kept up with real terms inflation for the last 40 or 50 years. We spend less than 10% of disposable income on average. Now, I know that's widely variable, but on average on food. And we're not getting the returns from the food that's being produced for the risk that goes into it. That is another reason that this change to policy is not affordable. And I think that is, the affordability of the change to IHT is something that it should be absolutely central to it. And at the moment, we don't believe farms can afford to pay the tax bill. Import standards is another one that I think is very, very important when we look at the ability of the market to function. I'd draw your attention to poultry, particularly broiler production, where I think that all we're doing, we're lowering our stocking density here in the UK, so raising our standards without the ability to build new sheds. We're drawing in imports from Poland, Thailand and Brazil that are produced worse standards than we are currently producing to. I mean, what's the rationale in that? So we need to look at what stops the market functioning properly in economic terms, and so that we can get to the bottom of this. But I think that's probably for another day rather than today.
And one of the big issues that's been raised with me by a local farm in my constituency who were farming potatoes for hundreds of years, growing potatoes for hundreds of years, and then have stopped last year, is the big supermarkets. They simply cannot compete in the way that the big supermarkets are running their procurement and the prices that they are paying for things, and that is being a death knell. One of my farmers described it to the industry.
So the competitive of our retail sector was exactly what I would highlighted, and they purchase a lot of our production. So look, this is something that I think we all need to, as an industry, say where do we want to be in 10 years' time, and what does sustainable production look like, and what reinvestment is required to get there, and how do we deliver that? And so that it's an incredibly competitive sector where many of our members do not get the returns and cannot pass the cost increases in. Now, this budget, beyond APR and BPR, hugely inflationary food production with national insurance and national living wages. Our horticultural sector, the intensive sectors, are really, really concerned that they're not going to be able to pass on those increased costs.
Would you welcome changes in the area of the big supermarkets and how they conduct themselves?
Look, I just think it's too simple to say yes or no to that, because I think there is room for looking at that, but I don't think that solves the question we're here really looking at today.
And just finally, you didn't touch on energy prices and the impact that's had. Has that been a big issue?
I'm very nervous about the energy market.
Obviously, this impacts on the wider profitability of the sector, but we are under pressure of time, and I'm keen to keep it focused if we can for the moment. And I do have to bring in Charlie Hill now. So, Charlie, can I?
Thank you. Victoria, you sort of alluded to that, the pebble in the pond, and the impact money that is taken out of the sector is then not spent on businesses. But BPR also affects people who are not farmers, other businesses in the rural economy, the rural community. Do you want to shed very briefly, because we're about to go to PMQs, but the impact that might have on other businesses surrounding the farmers?
I see that everybody's at the centre of a different web in the way the rural commercial kind of community works. We're a web of direct employment. So therefore, we're contributing by employing people, and they are going off and spending their available cash where they can. But we're also a web of indirect employment. I referred to Braze, I've referred to all of these people who we form a very small part of their annual turnover, but while we have the money to invest, that is all of us are all of their turnover. We are the people, and they too are having that effect. So what happens when we get a big tax bill? First thing, we look at direct employment. Who can we do without? And that's going to be more and more. It's going to be. It's very hard to do without people who actually do things. So it's quite hard to replace the doers. But it's not so hard now to replace, the administrative staff, all of those things that are built around. And maybe that's just the shape of the future, but the first place we'll look is direct employment. And the second thing will be the indirect. Which projects have we got phased in for next year, which we're now not going to even consider? Because, not necessarily because of inheritance tax, God willing, but because, of all of the other pressures, and also, as you were saying earlier, needing to put aside money to make allowances for this big change of direction. So, and I haven't ever really lived, apart from when I was at university, in a big urban conurbation. So I perceive, now I'm here a lot, that they have those same relationships. I think that perhaps they're more stark in a rural area, because there isn't somewhere else to go for that employment. If we let somebody go, they won't get it. Yep.
Bring us back on to John. You had a
a lot of things have been mentioned about profitability. You could talk about capital grants. The previous government didn't get the capital grants out quickly enough. You've got uncertainty over the land use framework. You've got the thresholds and the national insurance changes, etc., etc. But to try and get to the heart of this issue for today, how important, and the distribution of value across the supply chain for supermarkets. But if you had to sort of prioritise in terms of what you'd want from the government, in terms of things they need to fix most, the state says he wants more profitability. How would you put this APR, BPR issue in terms of the priority that you need to be fixed? There's so many things, as there always are, for government to deal with.
No, I think this is very easy, because if we went back to the 30th of October, it wasn't on the agenda. Let's remove this from the agenda while we fix the other problems. And that's the challenge, is that we've brought another problem into the sphere of challenges the farming industry is facing. We know the industry needs to make huge investment over the next decade to meet our environmental mitigation responsibilities. This takes cash that should be going to be invested in the future of our businesses to mitigate environmental risk. How it's a joined-up policy delivering food security when food security is being recognised as part of our national security, this just seems to be a distraction, and it's a rounding error in the budget. It's not that it's going to raise a significant amount of money. So I really think that this is a policy that can be removed without, and it's not bringing anything till 2027 anyway. So it feels like it's something that could be removed, consulted on, and we can remove this as an issue.
Based on all the other things that you need to...
All the other priorities, yeah. There's so many other priorities which were already on a burning platform, and then we've added something else to the pot. And
Victoria, Robert, do you agree with Tom's assessment?
Well, I suppose at the moment, if you look back over the years, every government has had a cheap food policy. And they've put the, if you call them a subsidy in place to mitigate that. Most people that I deal with would much rather get no payment from government, take it from the supermarket or from the consumer, because I don't have my plumber, my electrician saying, well, it's only so much an hour and then I'm going to get a top of the government. And that doesn't work. Whereas for me, if my milk price or my beef price isn't down, then there's a payment comes in to mitigate that. But as we've already mentioned about food security, but it's only in my father's generation that they remember rationing, and I'm very concerned that ministers are making decisions on a full stomach at the moment. And that's my concern.
I'm going to take that one.
Right, okay. On this point, though, we have reached midday. It may be that members' attention will now focus elsewhere in this building. So we're very grateful to you for your attendance, for your evidence today. We shall take further evidence and consider our reports. But thank you for your attendance. We are most grateful. Order.